in the United States. It's just one of several cases indicating a resurgence of violence and ugliness directed at African Americans. Yohuru Williams is an associate professor of African American history at Fairfield University. Is America turning back the clock on race relations?
Unfortunately, if we look at this week as a barometer, certainly we do seem to be sliding backward, at least in the way that we talk about issues dealing with questions of race. And the Trayvon Martin case has been responsible for a lot of that, stirring up some deep animosities on the part of African Americans about their treatment at the hands of the police or those who claim to be law enforcement, and then certainly on the part of whites who feel to a certain extent persecuted for the assumption that the society is inherently racist.
Well, sure, you've got the Tulsa, Oklahoma shootings targeting black folks. You got those kids in Mississippi. One of them just was convicted for running over a black man outside of a hotel. I mean, you put all this together and it's unsettling.
Very unsettling, and something that historically we've seen in economic times where there's deep economic recession. We do tend to see a rise of these type of hate crimes. Earlier today, you guys talked about a group that's emerged in France that's anti-immigrant. So we've seen this globally in other communities, but here in the United States, because of that long history, again, it's very troubling because we know what this generally winds up in, what it results in.
I want to talk about a columnist, John Derbyshire, who was recently fired from the National Review for a very controversial column that he wrote. Can you bring us, the viewers, up to speed on this?
Sure. He wrote a column called The Talk, Non-Black Version, and what it was an essay in reaction to a number of articles that were published by African Americans and other minorities in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin case, where they talked about having the talk with their children about how to survive in a society that's inherently racist. Well, what Mr. Derbyshire did was to take that and say, well, these are the things that white youth have to look out for.
And there are some pretty inflammatory things that he said.
Very much so.
Like, if you are in a group of African Americans, stay away.
Yes.
And now he was fired from the National Review for that.
He was. Rich Lowry, the editor of the National Review, essentially said that the essay was, the article was racist and indefensible, and the National Review was not going to tolerate that.
Now, it wasn't in the National Review, it was published in another online magazine, correct?
Mm-hmm. Tacky Magazine.
Tacky Magazine. Okay, but let's just talk a little bit about, some of his supporters say, well, it was satire. But he himself has not come out and said that it was satire.
In fact, it's very interesting. His supporters were trying to, in some sense, make this an issue of satire and say that this was intended to be tongue-in-cheek. Mr. Derbyshire was the one who said, not at all. I was serious. These are things that young people, white people have to take into consideration when dealing with African Americans. And that was very troubling.
What was your reaction when you read it?
I was deeply disturbed. I mean, again, when we talk about the polarizing nature of race in America, it's one of these instances where you see someone who is a public figure who has this forum and who behaves in that way, just indefensible. I agree with Rich Lowry.
The flip side of that, though, is when we look at ourselves internally, we look at that article and say, well, if I was white, I might tell my children the same thing. Mm-hmm. Is that perhaps an honest response?
It might be, and I think the interesting thing about this is that what this has done, unfortunately, this set of unfortunate circumstances from Trayvon Martin down to the Derbyshire article, the shooting in Tulsa, has forced all of us to re-examine where we are as a democracy in terms of how we deal with the issue of race. And what we've discovered is that we've become very good at talking about diversity and at least putting on the front of being accepting. But beneath the surface, there's a lot of animosity, a lot of anger, a lot of pain. And we're starting to see that obviously come to the surface in the way that people are dealing with each other and talking about some of these issues.
And what is it so much about the Trayvon Martin case that really, because there have been, as we've said, other cases in Oklahoma, race relations that is really just reignited and almost set this country into a white America and a black America.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because the Kerner Commission in 1968 talked about two societies, separate and unequal, and they warned of the dangers of the continuation of racial animosity if the government did not deal with that issue, the issue of poverty, inequality, and racism, back then. I think the Trayvon case, the reason, and I think partly Florida is responsible for waiting so long to charge him, it's allowed this to continue in the media, allowed this to continue with people in public forums, and that has contributed to this climate.
Do you think that they were waiting or ignoring and just bowing down to pressure?
I think they were trying to be thorough. At least I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, they wanted to have a thorough investigation, make sure their ducks were in a row, and I think the second-degree murder charge certainly points to that. But again, in this climate, it would have been better to act, and this may not. You know, again, the Tulsa shooting can't be directly attributed to this. Certainly, Jake England and Alvin Watts, the men that were responsible for that, had other issues, but the timing is just terrible.
And the officials are actually trying to play that off not as race, but as a hate crime.
Exactly, and they're trying to say, you know, certainly social media has led people to believe that this was a hate crime, that clearly he targeted African Americans to avenge his father's death, who was killed by an African American. But again, the African American community, the black community's response has been to target an entire community of people for the acts of one individual. That's crazy.
Yeah. And what's interesting is immigrant communities are watching this. If you look at their local papers, they're watching this because they're feeling some of the same things that African Americans are. So it's been interesting to have that conversation. So we'll jump on that on another day.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for joining us.
Good seeing you guys.
Appreciate it.